Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. George Russell continues to cause friction with F1 drivers, calling out Lando Norris today for his underperformance against Max Verstappen in this year's Championship Challenge, saying that if Russell was in the McLaren or the Red Bull, this year would have been a very different story indeed. With all the drama this weekend in Qatar, will Russell ever not rub some drivers up the wrong way? And the fans and the community at large as well. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. Before we begin, a proposition for you all. For those who aren't aware, I come from an esports background, and I'm a co-founder of Breaking Point GG, a media company that's done coverage in competitive Call of Duty for the last couple of years. We are now intending to expand into Formula 1. I think there's room to make the media coverage on website, on socials and elsewhere in Formula 1 significantly better than it presently is. That's what we're trying to do. Initially, we want to build a socials team. If you guys are interested, have experience in social media management, content creation, and love Formula 1, and keep up very closely with everything in that domain, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, this type of stuff, then feel free to get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Either DM the Breaking Point Twitter, which is right here, GG Breaking Point, or you can email us at contact@breakingpoint.gg. I will say, if you get in touch, please just don't say I'm interested, because we're going to get lots of people reaching out to us, I'm sure. So give us a bit more, right? Either say, hey, this is some post I did in the past, or this is a video that I made, or I've been a fan for this long of this certain team, or like I've been watching for this many years, and I'm, really keeping up very closely with many of the different social platforms. Whatever it is, we'd love to hear from you. If you've got a CV, attach it as well, that type of stuff. So if that sounds interesting for you to work on our team on expanding socials coverage into Formula 1, as I say, get in touch and give us as much detail as to why you'd be the best fit as you possibly can. Let's talk about the drama though, because we're going to start with the FIA today, as ever it seems as of late. Even Toto Wolff said over the weekends, the FIA can have its own reality show, and that is not changing anytime soon, because today, this is like crazy. It's not crazy because it's expected, but like, wow, motorsport's governing body wants to change its rules to limit the ways its leadership can be held account for bad governance, which is an incredible opening title here by Andrew Benson, but it basically does describe the situation. A set of revisions to the statute, so this is by the FIA, the governing body of Formula 1 and other motorsports, a set of revisions to the statutes governing the Audit and Ethics Committee has been circulated to member clubs to be approved at a vote of the FIA General Assembly on the 13th of December. Now, whether this will be approved, that's another question, but it would effectively install Mohammed Ben Sulayem as some sort of a dictator of the FIA. These would ensure that any ethics complaints were overseen by the FIA president and the president of its Senate, rather than the Senate itself. They would also remove the power of the Audit Committee to investigate financial issues independently. So it's pretty evident what's going on here, right? I mean, the president seemingly is proposing a revision to the statute that basically gives him all the power when it comes down to any internal investigation of wrongdoing, instead of being handled by the actual Audit and Ethics Committee, which is meant to ensure that things are being done by the book. Instead, the president and the president of the Senate, of which I'm sure there's a very interesting dynamic, they basically make the calls. I mean, what would Ben Sulayem do if he's being investigated on, and there's been various investigations on ethical concerns around the president over the last year or so, and the committee has looked into them. Those concerns have then been dismissed, and it's not like I expect those committees to necessarily do the best job anyway, but there's any drama there's been, the president's basically fired those that have caused any problems. And here we are again when, the president just wants full commands over whether any complaints are handled through him directly. So this sounds like a wonderful idea. We also have this coming out of Red Bull today I thought was kind of interesting, because we know that McLaren had that questionable rear wing, to say the least, in Monza, and then most especially in Baku. And there was talk about the constructors from Red Bull as to whether they could have still won it. The reality is that Perez has been horrific this year, especially since the summer break, and as a result, they were never really in contention. But Pierre Wache did say, when you see the rear wing of McLaren, I'm sorry, but it's more than a grey area. They use it for multiple races. Now, of course, there's arguments that Red Bull have been doing things over the last couple of seasons which have been either in or beyond the grey area, but look, that was obviously pretty evident what McLaren were doing, and Wache says, because without Baku, they would not win in Baku had they not had the cheating rear wing. Even in our Constructors' Championship, championship will be completely different. But I don't know if that's really true, because McLaren have only used that rear wing a couple of times, and sure, they were able to win Baku because of it, but if, you know, Piastri hadn't won in Baku, then Leclerc would have done. Would that really have helped Red Bull massively? Not necessarily, as far as I'm concerned. But De Kester was talking about this as well and says that, yeah, the rear wing of McLaren, the flexibility, the mini DRS, was worth 3 kph, and down a big straight like Baku, especially given how close Leclerc got on one or two occasions to making the overtake happen, you know, he reckons 100% chance Leclerc would have won that Grand Prix. Piastri wouldn't have done, which, you know, seems pretty plausible to me. Would it have massively helped Red Bull in the context of this season? Not necessarily. Although I will say the following on Max Verstappen, and this is also relevant to what George Russell is saying on Lando Norris in a few minutes' time, but I thought it was worth mentioning because going into Abu Dhabi, even if this year's championship had begun in Miami, let's not forget that was the first race that Lando won. So ignoring the first 4 rounds, which Verstappen dominated, since then, it's been generally a negative season for the RB20, right? He's been, and of course the car has been, reasonably competitive in several rounds. Obviously Brazil, he won. Qatar, he won, despite losing for 10 rounds in a row between Austria and of course the Mexican Grand Prix, but there were multiple rounds in that period where the RB20 was not competitive at all. Now, as I've said before, this competitiveness wasn't always necessarily against the McLaren. Sometimes it was against the Mercedes even, as in Las Vegas somehow, and sometimes against the Ferrari, but generally speaking, as in, you know, Singapore, Netherlands, circuits like that, absolutely. And to be fair, Lando won on both of those weekends, but still, there have been serious deltas that the RB20 has suffered. But yet, even through this period, Verstappen would have still won the title with a round to spare. Ignoring the first 4 rounds, Max still would have won the title. So it shows how good a job Max has done in absolutely maximising his weekend results, but it says something else about Lando Norris, and obviously Qatar was, you know, dramatic and controversial in terms of the penalty that he received, only getting 1 point in the end, but nonetheless the point still stands. Speaking of that penalty, I just wanted to clarify a little bit on why it was given, and also some of the McLaren reaction to it being given, and I thought F1 Guy Down did a good job really pointing out some of the problems here, because, well, this is what Andrea Stella said when the penalty was issued. Now, we talked about it yesterday, that over the last 10 years, there haven't been many incidents of a driver going straight through a double yellow flag in a race. And when it has been happening, it's a 10-second stop-and-go penalty. That is, by the rule book and by the precedents, what is generally done. But I think what McLaren are saying is that when are we going to go by the rulebook, and when are we going to go by some degree of referee discretion? Because let's not forget, the one-place penalty that Max was given on the Saturday was unprecedented, right? And it sets a very strange precedent in terms of what it means for the future. Russell was bombing it around the track on a slow lap, you know, came up to the back of Verstappen very quickly, and Max gets the penalty for it. It's all rather confusing. Even Fernando said after the penalty, it was like, well, I'm going to do exactly that at Abu Dhabi, go hard on a slow lap, come up behind someone and say, oh, they impeded me, that's got to be a penalty. And then it was, you know, a 3 place, but then it was only a 1 place because there was nothing Verstappen could do. Massively confusing, and obviously Max was not happy about Russell at all over this, said that, you know, he lost all respect for Russell, the way that he pushed very hard to get a penalty given to Max, and of course Max still won the race anyway, and Russell didn't even finish on the podium. But Stella is making the point that, yeah, it was a yellow flag deployed at the time, but then the yellow flag wasn't there all the time. Sometimes it was there, sometimes they took it away as certain drivers went by, even though the situation on the track was the same. So McLaren's argument is like, look, fair enough, the yellow flag, like what Lando did, was penalty worthy, but are we going to just go by the rules and say, well, is it a 10-second stop and go because of this? Or are we going to say, look, there is some discretion in this sport. The referees are able to consider all the alternatives, as he says, judge using these kind of elements, proportion and specificity, rather than taking any kind of the rule book probably full of dust on top of it, you know, without using a critical approach, you know, looking at the infringement, looking at the level level of danger associated with it, the fact that a yellow flag was removed for other drivers, and say, you know what, it probably wasn't deserving of a penalty that extreme. I don't necessarily mind it either way. Either we go by the rulebook every single time no matter what, or we use discretion and, you know, we have a critical approach to discuss what should be the right decision. But we've got to do one or the other. We can't be doing, oh, the rulebook says this, we're going to do this, and then, you know, the very day before we're doing something else, which is absolutely made on the whim, basically, of the referees of the day. That's the confusing thing for many. That's what McLaren are talking about. I thought it was a fair enough point. Colapinto, by the way, is probably not getting a drive for next year. I will say, I wonder how interested Alpine actually ever were. They're putting Jack Doohan in the car for Abu Dhabi. I just had this feeling that basically Flavio Briatore, knowing how he is, would have been interested in Colapinto just to drive the price up for Red Bull. I don't know if Alpine were ever seriously considering Colapinto. Apparently they were, but I did find it strange how Colapinto was doing a good job early doors in the Williams. Jack Doohan hadn't even got a chance yet to show what he could do in the Alpine, and yet Alpine was seemingly going to say to Doohan, unlucky mate, you've not even got a chance yet. Colapinto has, we're signing him instead. My feeling on this was that because Red Bull are interested, Alpine came along, maybe just to bump the price up. I don't know whether that was what Briatore was thinking, or whoever's making the calls over there now at Alpine, but I'm sure Briatore was to some degree involved. But yes, it seems that Colapinto, after a disappointing few rounds, is now no longer on the radar for Red Bull, and that is also true for Alpine as well, which, you know, maybe Alpine could have been interested anyway. Maybe their feeling is similar to Red Bull Racing's, but also Alpine may have just pulled out because Red Bull have pulled out. In the long term, this could be good for Franco. I know that there are many Argentines that would love to have him back on the grid again for next year, but it seems unlikely he'll stay in the Williams program, get developed over the next season or so as their reserve, and I think it could be good for him. Sending him to Red Bull could be a bit of a death sentence. We've seen that in the past. And going to Alpine, yeah, I'm never particularly massively full of trust for that organisation, especially a decision made so spontaneously as it seemed like that decision was going to be. But let's talk about the drama at Mercedes, right? Because Hamilton is clearly wanting to be out of there ASAP. He's basically said it every weekend now for quite some time that he just cannot wait to get out of Mercedes and get to Ferrari for next year. Of course, he had a terrible Qatar Grand Prix, and there were questions put to Fred Vasseur on, you know, is Hamilton washed up? Like, is he not going to be able to deliver next season? And it's definitely an interesting conversation because I rate Leclerc very, very highly. I think he's incredibly fast in qualifying, generally very consistent, excellent wheel-to-wheel racer. I think Leclerc is going to be a serious contender for world championships for years to come, and I'd be amazed if we look back on Leclerc's career and he's not a world champion at some point over the next few years. And Leclerc will pose a serious challenge to Hamilton. We know that he's been struggling with his qualifying pace recently, and these ground effect cars just don't really suit his style as well as some previous cars have done. It's not like next year's cars are going to be massively different to this year's car, but also it's going to be a Ferrari and not a Mercedes. It's going to be red, which maybe makes some difference anyway. We know that Hamilton's race pace has not been a question at all, and obviously Vasseur says that too. Have a look at his 50 laps in Vegas, driving, you know, the entire Grand Prix from P10 and finishing, I think even Vasseur said, on the gearbox of Russell, which was, you know, near enough, kind of like it was like 7 seconds off in the end, but that was commendable given the way the Grand Prix was run. So I think Ferrari know what Hamilton's capable of. I think Hamilton knows what Hamilton is capable of. I think it's just all about confidence for him, right? He's not been so head in the game for the last half of this season at Mercedes, and maybe there's been weird things happening there behind the scenes. I think for Hamilton, though, it's quite important to hit the ground running, because if he can, let's say the first 6 rounds of next year, Hamilton can go 3-3 with Leclerc in qualifying performance. I think, you know, and Hamilton feels more confident in the car maybe. I think that's going to be key, because if Hamilton comes out next year and his quali pace still isn't there compared to Leclerc, then, you know, he might get in his own head somewhat. And obviously, if you're qualifying behind your teammates, it's rather hard to win a championship consistently. But I think understandably Ferrari are not concerned about this. And obviously Mercedes have to be concerned with the fact that their car went from being the fastest car of all time in Las Vegas somehow to being kind of nowhere in Qatar, really. I mean, we're talking 7 to 8 tenths of a second off the pace. I mean, it wasn't good at all. You know, Verstappen and Norris were kind of cruising, and Russell was struggling to keep anywhere close to them, to be honest. And obviously at the end of the race, he got a 5-second pen, but didn't matter because he was far enough ahead of Gasly, I think, for like a safety car infringement. But yeah, they say Mercedes only seems to be good around there on low fuel. Of course, qualifying setup, the low drag setup limited the pace on the higher compounds. The front wing was basically not making the car turn enough. Both cars were struggling with understeer. Hamilton actually said that he reckons his puncture that he got was caused, at least in some part, by massive load in the front left tyre because of the huge understeer he was getting in the car. Hamilton isn't even 100% sure that it was debris that caused the puncture. He says it might have contributed, but it's quite likely that front left tyre was incredibly thin because they were doing, 30 plus laps on a medium compound tyre that was taking huge pressure in the front left because of the understeer that Mercedes had in the car, and, a small piece of that Albon mirror just completely cut it in shreds, it seems anyway. But Hamilton's teammate George Russell, having had a great result against Hamilton since the summer break especially, has been going, next level, right? I mean, Russell's been calling everyone out, he's been massively full of confidence, and I get it, right? Look, at the end of the day, do I hope Mercedes are competitive next year, at least competitive with Red Bull, so that we can get more Russell Verstappen on-track and off-track drama? Absolutely I do. I'm here for it. Is Russell making many fans the way that he's behaved recently? I don't necessarily think so, but he certainly is riling up some of his competitors. Russell, of course, to the media said various things, and then apparently he went behind the scenes to the stewards and said that Max slowed down on purpose to, impede his lap or whatever, and Horner even said that Russell was being hysterical. I think the penalty was more based on hysterics from George, who has been quite hysterical this weekend, but that's unfortunately, I think there was a bit of gamesmanship going on in that. We know that really ever since Baku 2023, when they came together in the sprint, there's been a lot of drama brewing behind the scenes between Russell and Verstappen, and then this last weekend we see Max call him out publicly after the race and say that he doesn't respect him anymore and all that stuff, and it's all been rather fun. Now Russell decided, you know what, I'm doubling down on this. I ain't trying to back down from a challenge from any particular angle, and Russell made the following comment on this year's championship. Of course, Russell is, P6 in the championship. Mercedes are fourth, locked in the constructors, but he said this: the difference between Verstappen and Norris is that when Max has had the chance, he's won, whereas his rivals who should have beaten him this year did not. Now, is Russell wrong? No, I think he's pretty much correct. But still, I'd say that Russell isn't exactly making the most friends, right? I mean, he's basically saying, yeah, Lando should have beaten him, should have capitalised and didn't, and also therefore makes the implication, and he even said later that, Max is very beatable, of course, until the most recent rounds. He'd won 1 out of 12 Grand Prix. Now he's won 3 out of 12, 3 out of 13, whatever it is, right, of the last several. But still, Max is beatable when obviously he doesn't have the best car by far, and if the cars are relatively equal, Max isn't always going to win, but he is always going to bring a game which is usually A to A+, and if you want to beat Max on a weekend when he's got a good car, you've got to bring your own A+ game, which is a big challenge to do consistently, and Max tends to do it week in, week out. McLaren and Lando haven't done that, even on weekends where they have had a car faster than Verstappen. Silverstone was an example really of strategy that cost them, and there have been other examples of Norris individually, of course, not executing. So Russell is therefore making the implication, and even just said it outright, I would have won the title in the McLaren or in the Red Bull. So, I like the confidence. I'm always going to respect a driver on some level, even if Max doesn't, who has this type of mentality. But equally, I don't think Russell is behaving in a way that's, going to make him best friends with many of the other drivers or with the community at large as well. I think certainly some of the way that Russell's has behaved and the way that Verstappen's talked about Russell in recent weeks has not helped his case in terms of his, PR. Some people actually call him, he's GR63. Some people call him PR63, as in, public relations, because he's pretty good at speaking in a certain way to the media, whereas that's not necessarily how he is behind the scenes. And I think everyone's kind of known this, and yet Verstappen made it very obvious as far as he's concerned. That is exactly the case. Does it make Russell a bad driver? No, he's very good, especially good on Saturday, as we know, and has got better and better, I think, at executing on Sunday, although his pace and his wheel-to-wheel craft and these type of things isn't Verstappen Verstappen level. Do I think he'd have done a better job this year, Russell, in the McLaren than Lando? I think I do. So, and even this, right, I mean, the Ferrari has been pretty good this year, but the McLaren's been better, and yet, you know, the numbers between Norris and Leclerc are actually very, very similar indeed. So, into your thoughts in the comments below. We go to Abu Dhabi this upcoming weekend. Max has now won here for the last 4 years in a row, so maybe he's going to close it on a high, and if he does so, likely McLaren are going to win the Constructors because there's not going to be enough points on the table. So Ferrari need a big weekend. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.